Ashes of Thornwood, written by S.K.J. Chapter 3. I woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the heavy curtains, the air in the room still and quiet. For a moment, I lay there, gathering my thoughts, trying to shake off the lingering heaviness from the night before. Today was the day before the wedding, a day that should have been filled with excitement and anticipation, but instead, all I felt was a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. As I pushed the covers aside and climbed out of bed, my bare feet sinking into the plush rug beneath me, I couldn't help but feel like I was sinking in more ways than one. The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on me, and I found myself longing for the comfort of home. I chose a simple, casual gown, one of the few I had brought with me that didn't require the help of a servant to lace up the back. The fabric was soft and worn, a comforting reminder of the life I was leaving behind. I didn't bother with shoes, preferring the cool touch of the floorboards against my skin. As I pulled my hair back into a loose braid, I barely cared that it wasn't as neat as Mrs. Thorn would prefer. If she thought I was feral, then maybe it was time I started living up to her expectations. The house was eerily quiet as I made my way downstairs, the weight of the silence pressing down on me with each step. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. As I wandered aimlessly through the corridors, my fingers brushed against the cold, polished wood of the banister, the smooth surface a stark contrast to the roughness I felt within. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though the house seemed empty, devoid of life. It wasn't long before I ran into Sarah, who was hurrying down the hall with an armful of linens. The sight of her, someone familiar in this strange place, brought a small measure of relief. "Good morning, Miss Evangeline," she said, dipping her head respectfully, though her eyes widened slightly as she took in my appearance. "Morning, Sarah," I replied, forcing a smile. "I'm just wandering, I suppose." Sarah hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was nearby before speaking again. "Mrs. Thorn is out this morning, miss. She's gone into town to choose your wedding gown." Her words hit me like a blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't even think. She's choosing my gown?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Yes, miss. She left early this morning. I'm sorry." I thought you knew. A hollow feeling settled in my stomach, a cold emptiness that seemed to spread through my entire body. Another decision made for me, another piece of my life taken out of my hands. Even the dress I would wear on my wedding day was not mine to choose. It was as if I were a doll, being dressed and prepared for some grand display. Forcing myself to stay composed, I managed a small, tight-lipped smile. "It's fine, Sarah. Thank you for telling me." Sarah looked like she wanted to say more, her brow furrowed with concern, but she shifted awkwardly and asked, "Is there anything else I can help you with, miss?" "Yes," I said, trying to focus on something else, anything else. "Do you know where Sebastian is?" "He's down by the lake, miss. He goes there sometimes when he wants to be alone." "Thank you, Sarah." I turned to head for the back door, eager to find some comfort in Sebastian's presence, but not before catching the worried look on Sarah's face as she watched me go. The morning air was cool against my skin as I stepped outside, the breeze carrying the scent of the water and the faint rustling of leaves. The path to the lake was easy enough to find, winding through a small grove of trees before opening up to the wide, serene expanse of water. The sounds of the house faded behind me, replaced by the gentle lapping of the water against the shore and the distant chirping of birds hidden among the trees. When I spotted Sebastian sitting on the bank, his back to me, tossing stones into the water with a steady, almost rhythmic motion, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. There was something both calming and melancholic in the way he moved, as if he were lost in thoughts he couldn't share. I approached quietly, not wanting to startle him, but when I was close enough, I couldn't resist teasing him. "You know, even if I wanted to run away, I couldn't. Your mother would probably hunt me down herself." Sebastian turned, surprised to see me there, but his expression softened into a smile when he saw my bare feet and simple dress. "Evie," he said, standing up and brushing the dirt from his trousers. "I didn't expect to see you up this early. I thought you'd still be resting after last night." "I couldn't stay in that room any longer," I admitted, moving to stand beside him. "I needed some fresh air, and I needed to see you." He looked down at the stones in his hand, turning them over slowly before letting them fall to the ground. "I'm sorry, Evie," he said quietly. "I should have stood up for you more last night. I didn't expect my mother to be so awful." I finished for him, though my tone was more resigned than angry. "I'm starting to think I'm the one who's been too naive, Sebastian. But I understand. Family is complicated. Still, it hurt. Sebastian nodded, his jaw tightening as he stared out at the water. The sunlight glittered on the surface, creating 1,000 tiny reflections that danced like fireflies. She's been difficult ever since my father died. It's like she's trying to control everything around her because she can't control what really matters. I reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. His skin was warm, his grip familiar and comforting, but there was a tension there too, something unspoken between us. I get it, I really do, but that doesn't make it any easier. He sighed, turning to look at me with a pained expression. I'll make it up to you, Evie, I promise. I smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. You don't have to make promises, Sebastian, just be honest with me. That's all I ask. He nodded, his gaze dropping to my bare feet. A small, genuine smile tugged at his lips. I hope you never change that about yourself, he said, his voice soft. That free part of you that doesn't care what anyone else thinks. It's one of the things I love most about you. I sat down abruptly, letting my feet sink into the blades of grass, feeling the cool earth beneath them. The wind shifted, blowing across the lake and sending small ripples across the water's surface. The scent of the trees and the damp earth surrounded us, grounding me in the moment, even as my thoughts spiraled. Your land is beautiful, I said, throwing my head back to feel the sun on my face. Sebastian sat down beside me, his eyes glued to me. You are beautiful, he said. I smiled softly, but didn't say anything. For the first time since knowing him, silence fell between us, heavy and uncertain, both of us unsure of what to say. You never mentioned you had a brother, Sebastian said quietly, breaking the silence. I drew my eyes off his to focus on the grass. Of course I didn't mention him, or took him. Down in the Carolinas, he died. There was no body. I took a deep breath, the words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. It was true. Benjamin had only been 23 years old, full of pride and conviction, ready to defend his country. His beliefs aligned with my father's, both of them convinced they were fighting for a just cause. But it didn't take long for us to realize that the war was not what we expected. Everywhere we went, a neighbor, a friend, even those we could hardly call acquaintances, were losing someone. I'm sorry, Sebastian said, his voice soft and sincere. That's when my father stopped taking care of the farm. Not that it was much of a farm to begin with, but after Benjamin died, he just stopped caring. There was a year of hunger for me and my family before he managed to clean himself up and open the shop. Money was something Sebastian had never had to worry about. He knew me as comfort, and I knew him as wealth. Talking about the part of my life that had been steeped in poverty was difficult, and I half expected him to look at me differently, to see me as lesser, but instead, his expression was one of understanding. What was his name? Sebastian asked gently. Benjamin. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I quickly blinked them away, not wanting to cry in front of him. What a fine name, Benjamin, he smiled, his voice full of respect. Without warning, he wrapped his arms around me and pulled me into a deep hug. It was unceremonious, almost inappropriate, but I hugged him back, grateful for the comfort. The sun climbed higher into the sky as we sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, the world around us momentarily forgotten. We walked along the edge of the water, the cool mud squishing between my toes as I let myself enjoy the moment with him. It was peaceful here, away from the house and the expectations that came with it. But even in this brief reprieve, I couldn't forget the looming shadow of tomorrow's wedding. As we walked, I slipped on a loose patch of earth, my foot sliding out from under me. With a surprised yelp, I tumbled forward into the shallow water, the coolness rushing over my legs as I fell. For a moment, I was too shocked to do anything, but then laughter bubbled up from deep inside me, breaking through the tension that had been building all morning. Sebastian was at my side in an instant, his boots splashing into the water as he reached down to help me up. Are you all right? He asked, concern flashing in his eyes. But I was laughing too hard to answer. I'm fine. I managed to gasp the absurdity of it all hitting me at once. Oh, Sebastian, look at me. He hesitated. Then a grin spread across his face. You're a mess, Evie, he teased, his eyes twinkling with amusement. As he leaned down to pull me up, I couldn't resist. I grabbed his arm and tugged, pulling him off balance and sending him toppling into the water beside me. He landed with a splash, water spraying up around us, and for a moment, we both just sat there, soaked and laughing like children. I can't believe you did that. Sebastian choked out, laughing even as he tried to wipe the water from his face. I couldn't resist, I replied, still giggling as I pushed myself up to stand. You looked too serious. He shook his head, his smile softening as he stood up beside me, his clothes clinging to his frame. You're something else, Evie. Together, we waded out of the water, our laughter trailing off into contented silence as we made our way back to the house. But as we approached, the moment of levity quickly dissipated at the sight of Mrs. Thorn standing at the back door, her arms crossed and her expression one of sheer horror. "Sebastian," she exclaimed, her voice sharp with disapproval. "What on earth have you two been doing?" "Relax, Mother," Sebastian said, his tone weary but firm. "We were just having a bit of fun. Nothing to worry about." "Oh," she repeated, her eyes narrowing as she looked me up and down. "You're both soaked through? This is hardly appropriate behavior, especially on the eve of your wedding." I said nothing, my earlier amusement now dampened by her icy glare. But Sebastian held his ground, his expression unyielding as he met her gaze. "It's all right, Mother. We'll clean up before dinner," Mrs. Thorn huffed, clearly not satisfied, but she didn't press the issue further. "See that you do," she said curtly before turning on her heel and marching back inside. Sebastian gave me an apologetic look. "I'm sorry about her, Evie. She's just like that." I nodded, trying to shrug off the weight of her disapproval. "It's all right. I suppose I'll have to get used to it." He sighed and gave my hand a squeeze. "I'll see you later?" I nodded again, forcing a smile. "Yes, later." As we parted ways, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease, a small voice in the back of my mind reminding me that tomorrow, everything would change. I stood in the small, tiled bathroom, steam curling around me as I reached for a towel. The hot water had done wonders, washing away the remnants of my tumble into the lake and soothing some of the tension that had settled into my muscles. As I stepped out of the bath, a slight chill crept over me, and I wrapped the towel tightly around myself. A soft knock sounded at the door. "Come in," I called, expecting to see Sarah. The door creaked open, and Sarah slipped in, her gaze respectfully averted. She held out a clean dress in one hand and a basin in the other. "I brought you a fresh dress, Miss Evie," she said quietly, setting the basin on the small table beside the door. "Thank you, Sarah," I replied, trying to muster a smile. I handed over the soiled clothes I had peeled off before my bath. "I'm sorry, these are such a mess." Sarah took the damp, dirt-streaked clothes with a quick nod. "It's no trouble, miss. I'll have them cleaned and pressed by tomorrow." I hesitated as she moved to leave. Something in the way she clutched the clothes to her chest, as though they were a shield, made me want to reach out. "Sarah," I said, my voice tentative, "can I ask you something?" Sarah paused, turning back to face me. "Of course, miss." What do you think of Mrs. Thorn?" The question slipped out before I could second-guess myself. I held my breath, watching Sarah's reaction. For a moment, she looked as though she might not answer. She glanced nervously toward the door, then back at me, her eyes wide with concern. But then, in a small voice, she said, "Mrs. Thorn is a difficult woman, miss. She likes things done her way, and she doesn't take kindly to anyone who doesn't fit her expectations." There was a hint of something in Sarah's tone, something that suggested she had endured Mrs. Thorn's ire more than once. My heart ached for her. "I suppose I'm not exactly what she had in mind for her son," I said, attempting a light tone, though the weight of the truth pressed heavily on my chest. To my surprise, Sarah let out a small, involuntary laugh, quickly covering her mouth with one hand as her eyes widened in horror at her own audacity. "I'm sorry, miss," she blurted out, her cheeks flushing crimson. "I didn't mean to—" "It's all right, Sarah," I interrupted gently, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Honestly, it's nice to know I'm not the only one who sees it. You don't need to worry." Sarah's relief was palpable, though she quickly resumed her serious demeanor. "Thank you, miss. I should take these to be cleaned." She nodded toward the bundle of clothes in her arms. "Of course," I said, watching as Sarah hurried from the room, the door clicking softly behind her. The brief moment of levity had lifted my spirits, but it was fleeting, and as I dressed in the fresh clothes Sarah had brought, a familiar sense of unease settled over me once more. A short while later, I found myself dressed, still barefoot on my way back down the stairs, intending to find Sebastian again. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I paused, taking a deep breath before pushing open the heavy double doors of the drawing room. The sight that greeted me was not what I was expecting. A large, full-length mirror stood to one side of the room, and in the center, suspended from a wooden dress form, was the wedding gown. Mrs. Thorn stood nearby, her posture stiff and regal, while a local seamstress, an older woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, fussed with the hem of the dress, ensuring it hung just right. "There you are, Evangeline," Mrs. Thorn said, her voice clipped as always. "Come. We must see how it fits." I approached slowly, my eyes fixed on the gown. It was beautiful. There was no denying that. The fabric was rich and elegant, a soft ivory silk with intricate lace detailing at the sleeves and neckline. It was the kind of gown I might have dreamed of as a child, playing pretend weddings with Lottie. But now, standing here under Mrs. Thorn's scrutinizing gaze, it felt more like a costume, a role I was being forced to play. The seamstress stepped aside as I reached the dress, her eyes warm as she smiled up at me. "You'll be a vision in this, Miss Evangeline," she said kindly. "Let's get you into it, shall we?" I nodded. Though my hands trembled slightly as I reached for the delicate fabric, Mrs. Thorn watched me closely, her expression unreadable. With the seamstress's help, I slipped into the gown, the cool silk gliding over my skin as it settled into place. The seamstress moved quickly, adjusting the bodice and smoothing the skirt until it flowed perfectly. When I finally turned to face the mirror, my breath caught in my throat. The woman staring back at me was beautiful, dressed in a gown fit for a queen. But there was something in her eyes, something distant, almost sad, that made me feel as though I were looking at a stranger. Mrs. Thorn circled me, her eyes narrowing as she inspected every detail. "It'll do," she said after a long moment, her tone begrudging. But then she added, almost as an afterthought, "Though we'll have to let it out a bit at the waist. Evangeline is broader than I anticipated." My cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but I forced myself to remain composed. "It's perfect," I said quietly, though the words felt hollow in my mouth. The seamstress, sensing my discomfort, quickly stepped in. "You look stunning, Miss Evangeline," she said, her voice gentle and reassuring. "The gown suits you beautifully." I offered the woman a small, grateful smile. "Thank you." Mrs. Thorn, clearly unimpressed by the seamstress's sentiment, moved to a small table nearby and retrieved a pair of shoes. "These will complete the ensemble," she said, holding them out for me to see. The shoes were exquisite. Delicate satin slippers with small pearl embellishments along the toes. They were undeniably lovely, but as I took them in my hands, I felt a pang of reluctance. The shoes, like the gown, were a symbol of everything this marriage represented. A life of refinement and restraint, a world where appearances were everything. "They're beautiful," I said softly, though the words felt like a lie. "Of course they are," Mrs. Thorn replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "Now, do try to wear them with some grace, Evangeline. This isn't the time for your rustic inclinations." I bit back a retort, forcing myself to smile as I nodded. "I'll do my best," I said, though my heart wasn't in it. The seamstress helped me out of the gown, and I was relieved to be free of it, the heavy fabric slipping away as though I were shedding a layer of someone else's skin. As I stood there, now back in my simple dress, I felt the weight of the day pressing down on me once more. "Thank you," I said to the seamstress as the woman carefully packed the gown away. "Don't worry, dear," she replied with a warm smile. "You'll be a beautiful bride." I nodded, but as I glanced at Mrs. Thorn, who was busy inspecting the shoes for any imperfections, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Tomorrow, I would be married. Tomorrow, I would officially become part of this world. A world that felt more like a gilded cage with each passing moment. As I left the drawing room, the shoes still clutched in my hands, the sense of foreboding that had been lurking in the back of my mind grew stronger. Tomorrow, everything would change, and no matter how beautiful the gown or how delicate the shoes, I couldn't shake the fear that I was stepping into a life that would never truly be my own.